You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
That reveal on the beach rocked audiences. If the Planet of the Apes was post-apocalyptic, then the entire story needed to be re-examined, start to finish. But really looking back, the clues of the apocalypse were all around them. After all, humans lived on the Planet of the Apes, and the apes themselves spoke English. And they were surrounded by wastelands, and the archaeological sites had advanced artifacts. It was staring us in the face, really. We just didn't see it. It's been nearly 50 years since Planet of the Apes, but I must ask, are we observing the same story with Game of Thrones and its literary counterpart, A Song of Ice and Fire? The knee-jerk answer for a fan is, no, that's not true, that's impossible. Planetos is a fantasy world filled with magic, skin-changing, and monsters. But then again, is that really so different from a science fiction world filled with technology, telepathy, and genetic engineering?
I remember having a conversation with an HBO executive and saying, this isn't the kind of show that gets nominated for things because they don't like fantasy shows, science fiction. That just doesn't happen.
Let's step back for a moment and talk about technology and how it's presented in Planetos' history. Generally speaking, we know that technology moves in a forward direction. Today we can do things our ancestors couldn't. We have computers, and airplanes, and breast implants, while the Mayans, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians had none of these. In fact, archaeologists note technological achievements when they dig up civilizations. Did a given people use bronze tools or iron tools? Did they barter or have money? Did they have a written language or just oral tradition? There are, of course, exceptions to technological progress. After a civilization collapses due to war, famine, or resource exhaustion, people scramble for survival and there can be technological regression. Most famously, and perhaps somewhat historically inaccurately, the fall of Rome regressed Western Europe into the so-called Middle Ages. Medieval Westerners suffered through centuries of primitive feudal living, all the while haunted by relics of their Roman past. In fact, the term Middle Ages denotes regression. It is the time in the middle, between the fall of Rome and the rebirth of the Renaissance. Westeros seems to be a caricature of Western Europe in this respect. In place of centuries of reversion, it's millennia. And in place of ruined aqueducts, roads, and stadiums, it's the battlements of the previous ages. Westeros has Storm's End, a colossal fortress with perfectly smooth walls and genius engineering. And there's Casterly Rock, a city intricately carved into a mountain. And of course, there's the Wall, hundreds of miles of ice, stacked as high as skyscrapers. Not to mention the enigmatic Ship of Sunspear, the miraculously tunneled Winterfell, and the awe-inspiring Eyrie. It's pretty clear that the medieval world of Westeros would be unable to recreate any of these marvels from its past, and it would take a rather futuristic society to create the Wall or Storm's End, especially when you consider that whatever Storm's End is made of, it hasn't gotten cracks or holes in 8,000 years. Today we can create perfectly smooth walls out of cement, but it wears down. And who knows what's keeping the wall from sublimating? So where on earth did these structures come from? Unlike medieval Western Europe, Westeros has no romantic tales of a technologically advanced past. According to their legends, their backward medieval feudalism goes back 12,000 years to their earliest times, the dawn of days. So again, where did these structures come from? Well, stories claim they were built with magic. Of course, the definition of magic is a little sketchy. Technology to a primitive society would appear to be magic. Are we talking about metaphorical magic, or are we talking about literal spells shooting from wands? It's a big unknown. In either case, it's clear that Westeros has regressed, either technologically or magically or both. Some traumatic event occurred that made it so humanity could no longer create the great wonders of the past. In addition, this event left humanity in an 8,000-year dark age. So what was that event? Well, the most obvious event was the Long Night, a supposedly extended period of winter that lasted years. In fact, it perhaps lasted a generation if stories can be believed. Of course, here in the real world, we also have the ability to create long periods of cold and darkness that can last years. They're called nuclear winters. Soot from nuclear explosions gets in the atmosphere and blocks out the sun, creating global cooling. It could be that there was once a technologically advanced Planetos, one capable of constructing things like Storm's End and the Wall. And it could be that they engaged in nuclear war, and in the wake of the war, Planetos fell into a nuclear winter and regressed to a more primitive level of technology. In fact, if one sets aside legends and magic, it would seem to be the most logical explanation. And it wouldn't be the first time that George R. R. Martin wrote about this subject. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Martin wrote dozens of science fiction stories about humanity emerging from a dark age of technological regression. Most of these stories took place in his Thousand Worlds universe, where a devastating interstellar war left hundreds of planets without spaceflight for a generation or longer. A couple of these stories, notably one called Bitter Blooms and another called In the House of the Worm, even had civilization falling back to medieval levels of technology. The Long Night being a nuclear winter would explain quite a lot. Besides explaining Westeros' regression, it would explain why so many places in the world are subterranean. The tunnels under Winterfell, Casterly Rock, and the mines of the Iron Islands could have all been nuclear bunkers, built to shield the population from radiation. And nuclear warfare would also explain why certain places like the Red Waste over in Essos are uninhabitable. Now, the biggest argument against Westeros being a formerly advanced world is there seems to be so few relics of past greatness. Yes, there's the Wall and a few great fortresses, but where are the ray guns, and the hyposprays, and the sonic screwdrivers? If the world used to be so advanced, shouldn't it be swimming in the junk of its sci-fi past? But then again, where is any of the junk of the past? The first men of Westeros had a written language, and yet there's no surviving written histories, just a few runes on rocks. How is that possible? Somehow, the later Andal invaders introduced the idea of literature and history and books to the First Men, a civilization that had once built the Wall and Storm's End. How did First Men engineers get by without being able to write things down like math and angles? In A Clash of Kings, Catelyn says Storm's End has a wall with stones fit so cunningly together that nowhere was a crevice, nor angle, nor gap by which the wind might enter. Even if we accept that magic was utilized with levitation and stone-cutting rays, how did the First Men even coordinate such a feat? Could they really do it without writing things down? On a related note, where are all the iron weapons? Supposedly, the First Men had bronze weapons and were at a disadvantage against the iron-wielding Andal invaders. And yet the Ironborn on the Iron Islands have been mining iron long before the Andals arrived. In fact, the Iron Kings before the Andal invasion were named Grey Iron. And yet somehow none of this iron seems to have been used for weaponry. Somehow, improbably, the Andals advanced Westeros from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. Of course, it could be that writing and iron tools did exist and just aged away. Paper rots and iron rusts, and our author knows this. The Winterfell crypts are filled with iron swords that simply went to dust over the centuries. But if we recognize that iron and paper can vanish over time, then we must also recognize that plastics and other modern materials also degrade. Not to mention, nuclear war and 8,000 years of passing time can do much to erase the signs of the past. Relics become buried deep beneath the earth, and people forget. The rills of the north are filled with burial mounds from thousands of years ago. Legends say they're the tombs of kings, but has anyone actually dug them up? Westeros doesn't seem to have a booming archaeological community. It should be noted that the idea of questioning Westeros' past has already been presented to us in our story. In the first Samwell chapter of A Feast for Crows, Sam points out that written history came with the Andal invasion, so what happened previously is really only hearsay. In fact, Sam says that some maesters question all of it, and if the most educated scholars of Westeros question its history, perhaps we should question it as well. So what we know is that Westeros clearly had a more advanced past, and its history as presented to us doesn't make sense. But there's actually more. Remember that story I told you about called In the House of the Worm? You know, one of George R. R. Martin's post-apocalyptic medieval stories? It's actually about the descendants of two factions of genetic engineers. One faction had a silver Theta for their sigil, and the other had a golden Theta for their sigil. And these Thetas keep appearing in Game of Thrones. Here's a gray or silvery Theta in the first episode of the first season of Game of Thrones. The Theta is on its side. And here's a yellow or golden Theta from the last episode of the first season of Game of Thrones. And here is Sansa with a Theta necklace at the end of the fourth season of Game of Thrones. So what am I saying, that the creators of Game of Thrones actually read In the House of the Worm? Well, it seems they at least read the comic book adaptation of it. In the comic book adaptation of In the House of the Worm, the golden Theta is stylized with a black bar in the middle. It's a rather unique way to present a golden Theta, and at the end of the first season of Game of Thrones, we find the same stylistic choice. Now, I'm not saying these genetic engineers are on Westeros. This is likely only an homage, but we should at least ask why the creators of Game of Thrones find it necessary to pay homage to an obscure post-apocalyptic sci-fi tale from the 1970s. It seems quite likely that Westeros' past has some futuristic origins. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about this subject, you can check out my Minds of Wolves and Robins series, where we talk all about Bran and the Children of the Forest, or you can check out the Thousand Worlds Book Club, where we're going through all of George R. R. Martin's Thousand Worlds works. See you next time.